The sun hung like a molten copper disk in the cloudless Arizona sky, casting harsh shadows across the deserted main street of Mesa Falls. A lone figure appeared on the horizon, his duster coat trailing dust as he guided his horse toward the sleepy desert town. The few townspeople brave enough to venture out in the midday heat paused in their activities, watching the approaching stranger with a mix of curiosity and wariness. The rider's features remained hidden beneath the wide brim of a weather-beaten hat, but there was something in his bearing, a deadly grace in the way he sat his horse, that made even the most casual observer take notice. His mount, a powerful black stallion, moved with the quiet precision of an animal well-trained for trouble. As he reached the edge of town, a tumbleweed skittered across his path, dancing in the hot wind that whistled between the buildings. The stranger didn't flinch, didn't alter his course. He simply guided his horse down the main street, past the general store where Old Man McCready stood in his doorway, past the telegraph office where young Billy Wells pressed his face against the dusty window for a better look. The Broken Spur Saloon stood like a weathered sentinel in the heart of Mesa Falls, its swinging doors creaking in the relentless wind. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, securing his horse to the hitching post with practiced efficiency. His spurs jingled softly as he stepped onto the wooden walkway, the planks groaning beneath his weight. Inside the saloon, conversations died mid-sentence as the batwing doors swung open. The stranger paused in the doorway, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The usual crowd of ranch hands and drifters occupied the tables, while in the corner, a group of rough-looking men played cards with exaggerated casualness. Their hands never strayed far from their holsters. The stranger moved to the bar, his steps measured and deliberate. Each movement spoke of a man who never wasted motion, never acted without purpose. The bartender, a grizzled veteran of countless bar fights and shootouts, found himself unconsciously straightening his spine as he approached. "Whiskey," the stranger said, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that made the single word sound like a command. The bartender nodded, reaching for his best bottle. Something in the stranger's demeanor demanded nothing less. In the corner, the card players watched with predatory interest. Their leader, a young gun with too much swagger and too little sense, fingered his pistol suggestively. The stranger seemed not to notice, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was aware of every movement in the room. Whispered conversations rippled through the saloon. There had been rumors of a notorious gunslinger heading this way, a man whose very name made hardened outlaws check their guns and watch their backs. No one knew his face, but everyone knew the stories. Impossible shots, lightning-fast draws, and a trail of dead men stretching from Texas to the territories. The stranger lifted his glass, taking a measured sip of whiskey. In the mirror behind the bar, his eyes, steel gray and unnaturally calm, surveyed the room. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the subtle gleam of his well-maintained revolver. The stage was set. In Mesa Falls, trouble had a way of finding men who waited long enough, and this stranger didn't look like he was planning to leave anytime soon. Clay Jenkins had never learned when to keep his mouth shut. He sat at his corner table in the Broken Spur, whiskey glass forgotten as he studied the stranger at the bar. The afternoon heat had driven most customers away, leaving the saloon eerily quiet except for the lazy buzzing of flies and the occasional clink of glasses. "Hey, mister!" Clay called out, his voice sharp with false cheer. "Ain't polite to come into a man's town without introducing yourself." The stranger didn't turn around. He simply lifted his glass, taking another unhurried sip of whiskey. This apparent dismissal brought a flush of anger to Clay's young face. Briggs, the oldest of the outlaws, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Leave it be, Clay," he muttered. "Man's just having a drink." But Clay was already pushing back his chair, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He was young, fast, and had 3 notches on his gun, enough to make him dangerous, not enough to make him wise. "I'm talking to you, stranger!" Clay's hand rested casually on his holster. "Unless you're too scared to face me properly?" The stranger finally turned, his movements smooth and unhurried. His eyes, cold as a mountain stream, settled on Clay with unnerving intensity. "There's no profit in fear," he said quietly, "or in dying over a drink." A few of the remaining patrons edged toward the door. They'd seen this dance before. Young guns trying to make a name for themselves, usually ending up in a pine box for their trouble. That a fact? Clay's grin showed too many teeth. "How about we step outside? See who's faster? Winner buys the drinks." "Son," the stranger's voice carried a note of warning, "you're trying to start something you can't finish." Briggs stood up slowly, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd survived 20 years of gunfights and ambushes by learning to read men, and everything about this stranger screamed danger. "Clay," Briggs warned, "I've seen fellas like this before. In Mesa Falls during the war. The quiet ones. They're the ones you don't provoke." But Clay was too far gone, his pride demanding satisfaction. He took 2 steps forward, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "Maybe you're just yellow. That it, old man? Afraid to draw on someone who's looking you in the eye?" The stranger set his glass down with deliberate care. For a moment, the entire saloon held its breath. Then he spoke, his words carrying to every corner of the room. "Last chance, boy. Walk away." The bartender ducked behind his bar. Someone whispered a prayer. Clay's face twisted into a sneer as his hand twitched toward his gun. But before he could clear leather, the stranger had already moved. It happened so fast, most people missed it. One moment, the stranger was at the bar. The next, he was holding Clay's gun belt, cleanly cut from his waist without a shot fired. Clay stood frozen, his face pale with shock as his holster hit the floor with a dull thud. "Jesus!" Briggs breathed, recognizing the impossible speed of the move. "Clay, you damn fool! Do you know who this must be?" But Clay was already backing away, his bravado shattered. The stranger turned back to his drink as if nothing had happened. But everyone in the Broken Spur knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary and terrifying. Evening crept across Mesa Falls like a purple bruise, painting long shadows between the buildings. The stranger walked the dusty streets alone, his boots leaving clear impressions in the cooling sand. Behind drawn curtains, townspeople watched his passage, trading whispered theories about his identity. "Heard tell of a man like that down in Texas," Mrs. Henderson muttered to her neighbor as they peered through her front window. "They called him the Ghost. Never missed a shot, never lost a fight." "Nonsense," replied Mr. Tucker from the general store. "That's got to be John Wesley Hardin himself. Who else moves that fast with a gun?" The stranger paid no mind to the gossip that followed in his wake. His eyes constantly scanned his surroundings, a habit born from years of watching for ambush. As he passed the livery stable, a flash of memory struck him. Another stable, years ago, flames reaching toward a night sky, thick with gun smoke. He pushed the image away, but not before his hand unconsciously touched the silver watch chain at his vest. The Mesa Falls Hotel stood at the end of the street, its weathered sign creaking in the evening breeze. Inside, old Sam Porter looked up from his ledger as the stranger entered. The lobby was empty except for a sleeping cat and the lingering smell of tobacco. "Room for the night," the stranger said quietly. Sam nodded, trying not to stare at the well-worn gun belt or the way the stranger positioned himself with his back to the wall. "Sign here," he said, pushing forward the registry. "$1 a night, extra 2 bits for breakfast." The stranger paid in silver coins that clinked heavily on the wooden counter. As he turned toward the stairs, the saloon's bartender, Joe Miller, burst through the front door. "Mister," Joe called out, slightly out of breath. "Need a word, if you don't mind." The stranger paused, 1 foot on the bottom step. Joe glanced nervously over his shoulder before continuing. "Clay's gang. They ain't just local troublemakers. They've got connections, dangerous ones. After what happened today," he trailed off, wiping sweat from his brow. "Well, a man ought to know what's coming for him." The stranger studied Joe for a long moment. "I've had things coming for me before," he said finally. His voice carried the weight of old battles and older regrets. "Maybe so," Joe persisted. "But these fellows, they don't fight fair, and with the sheriff away in Tucson," he shook his head. "Look, There's a stage leaving for Yuma tomorrow morning. No shame in... There's always shame in running, the stranger cut him off. The words hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. Joe recognized the tone. He'd heard it before, from men who'd seen too much death to fear it anymore. With a resigned nod, he turned to leave, but paused at the door. "At least tell me you ain't alone in this," he said. "Tell me you got somebody riding with you." The stranger's hand again touched the silver watch chain, his eyes distant. "A man's never alone," he said softly, "long as he's got his ghosts." As Joe left, the stranger climbed the creaking stairs to his room. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and Mesa Falls settled in for what everyone suspected would be a very short night of peace. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows across the walls of Mesa Falls' livery stable as Clay paced between the stalls, his wounded pride evident in every step. Briggs sat on a hay bale, cleaning his revolver with methodical precision, while Jennings and Two-Bit Tommy lounged against the doorframe, keeping watch. "Made me look like a damn fool," Clay spat, kicking an empty bucket across the stable floor. The horses shifted nervously at the noise. "Nobody does that to me! Nobody!" "Told you to leave him be," Briggs said without looking up from his gun. "Some men you don't prod unless you're ready for what comes after." Two-Bit Tommy, a rail-thin man with tobacco-stained teeth, spat a stream of juice into the dirt. "What comes after is we show him what happens when you cross the wrong bunch. 4 against 1. I like their odds." "You ain't thinking big enough," Jennings cut in, his scarred face serious in the lamplight. "Mendoza's coming up from Mexico next week. He ain't gonna like hearing some stranger interfering with his plans for Mesa Falls." The name brought them all to silence. Don Rafael Mendoza was more than just another border bandit. He was a rising power in the territories, with enough men and money to make governors nervous. "Mesa Falls is perfect," Briggs explained, finally looking up from his weapon. "Small enough, nobody pays it much mind, big enough to serve as a waypoint. Mendoza wants to move merchandise through here. Guns south, silver north. Town like this, sitting quiet between two territories, it's worth gold to him." Clay stopped pacing, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "So we don't just deal with strangers, we make an example. Show everyone in Mesa Falls what happens when they don't play along." "Sheriff's still in Tucson," Two-Bit added. "Won't be back for 3 more days at least." Jennings pushed himself off the doorframe, his spurs jingling. "I say we start tomorrow. Hit McCready's store first. Old man's been refusing to pay protection anyway. Make it messy, make it public." "And if the stranger interferes?" Briggs asked, his tone carrying a note of warning. "Then we find out if he's really as fast as they say," Clay answered, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where his gun belt had been cut. 4 guns against 1. Like Tommy said, I like their odds." They spent the next hour planning, their voices low as they worked out the details. None of them noticed the shadow that briefly crossed the stable's high window or heard the soft crunch of boots moving away through the desert night. "One thing's certain," Briggs said as they finished. "After tomorrow, Mesa Falls is going to understand who really runs things around here. Mendoza's coming, and this town better be ready when he does." Clay checked his new gun belt, making sure the leather was stiff and ready. "Tomorrow, then, we show that stranger and everyone else what happens when they stand in our way." As they left the stable, the moon cast their shadows long across the empty street. In the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely sound that seemed to carry a warning in its wild voice. Mesa Falls slept uneasily, unaware that tomorrow would bring more than just another desert sunrise. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Clay's gang made their move. They burst into McCready's mercantile like a summer storm, all thunder and destruction. Briggs kicked over a barrel of flour, sending white powder billowing through the air, while Jennings swept his arm across a shelf, sending canned goods crashing to the floor. "Morning, McCready," Clay called out with mock cheerfulness. "Heard you've been having trouble making your protection payments. Thought we'd stop by and discuss terms." Old man McCready stood behind his counter, his white-knuckled hands gripping the wooden edge. Mrs. Peterson and her young son cowered in the corner near the seed displays, while Tom Wilson, a local rancher, slowly backed toward the door. "Don't try it!" Two-Bit Tommy warned Wilson, revealing a shotgun from beneath his duster. "Ain't nobody leaving till business is done." Briggs vaulted over the counter, grabbing McCready by his shirt collar. "3 weeks behind, old man. That's bad for business, bad for your health, too." He punctuated the threat by slamming McCready against the shelves. The store's bell chimed softly. The stranger stood in the doorway, his frame silhouetted against the morning light. He'd left his duster somewhere, and his gun belt rode low and well-worn on his hips. "Let him go," the stranger said quietly, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent store. Clay turned slowly, a cruel smile playing across his face. "Well, look who's joined our little business meeting. Ain't so tough without the element of surprise, are you?" "Last warning," the stranger replied, not moving from his position. "Let these people be." Briggs released McCready with a shove, sending the old man stumbling. "4 guns against 1, mister, even if you ain't that fast." "Doesn't have to end in gunfire," the stranger said. His eyes moved from man to man, marking positions, distances, angles. "Walk away now. No one gets hurt." Clay's laugh was sharp and ugly. "No one gets hurt? After what you did to me yesterday?" He drew his gun with practiced speed, firing a shot into the ceiling. Plaster dust rained down as Mrs. Peterson screamed, clutching her son closer. "That's just a taste," Clay continued. "Next one goes lower unless you turn around and pretend you never saw anything." The stranger's hands remained away from his guns. "There's women and children here," he said, his tone carrying a weight of experience. "This isn't the way." "This is exactly the way," Clay snarled, swinging his gun toward McCready. "Someone needs to learn." The stranger moved. One moment he was in the doorway, the next he was rolling across the floor as Clay's shot splintered the doorframe. Two-Bit's shotgun roared, but the stranger was already behind a stack of feed sacks. His own gun appeared in his hand as if by magic, its report sharp and controlled. The shotgun flew from Two-Bit's grasp, his hand bleeding from where the stranger's bullet had creased it. Before anyone could blink, 2 more shots rang out. Clay's gun went spinning away, and Jennings found his weapon mysteriously struck from his grip. Only Briggs still held his gun, but he was already lowering it, a look of grudging respect on his weathered face. "Like I said," the stranger spoke into the ringing silence, "doesn't have to end in gunfire, but it will if you push it further." Word of the shootout at McCready's spread through Mesa Falls like wildfire. By mid-morning, every porch and parlor buzzed with talk of the stranger's lightning-fast draw. Some claimed he'd shot the guns right out of the Outlaws' hands without spilling a drop of blood. The stranger sat alone at a back table in Diana's cafe, sipping black coffee and watching the street through the window. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare, where people hurried about their business, stealing glances at the cafe as they passed. "Mind if I join you?" The voice belonged to an older man with silver hair and a weathered face. A tin star, worn smooth by time, hung from his faded leather vest. "Willis," the man said, settling into the chair. "Used to be a deputy here back before the war. Still keep my hand in when the sheriff needs help." The stranger nodded slightly but offered no conversation. Willis studied him over his coffee cup, noting how the man's eyes never stopped moving, checking angles, marking distances. "Seen men move like you before," Willis continued quietly. "During the war, mostly. One in particular comes to mind." He paused. They called him the Silver Brand, named for a pocket watch he carried, pure silver, with an eagle engraved on the case. The stranger's hand moved slightly toward his vest pocket. Story goes he was the fastest gun in 3 territories, never killed unless he had to, preferred to shoot the weapons right out of men's hands. Some said it was mercy. Others said it was a special kind of cruelty, leaving men alive to remember how badly they'd been beaten. "Stories grow tall in desert air," the stranger replied, his voice low. "That they do, but some stories cast long shadows. Take them Outlaws this morning, 4 armed men, and not one dead. That takes a special kind of skill, a familiar kind. The cafe had grown quiet, other patrons straining to hear their conversation. "Town's changing," Willis said. "Sheriff's been away too long. Clay's gang is getting bolder. Now there's whispers about someone named Mendoza moving in." He leaned forward. Mesa Falls could use a man like the Silver Brand. If he was still riding, that is. The stranger finally met Willis's gaze. "Man can't outride his past forever, but that doesn't mean he's looking for new troubles." "Sometimes trouble finds a man whether he's looking or not," Willis countered. "Question is, when it does, will he stand alone?" The stranger's hand touched the silver chain at his vest. "A man who stands for right is never truly alone," he said finally. "But he'd be a fool to turn away honest help when it's offered." Willis smiled slightly and rose, placing a hand on the stranger's shoulder. "Welcome to Mesa Falls," he said quietly, "for however long you choose to stay." The Broken Spur's bat-wing doors swung open at dusk, admitting the stranger into the lamp-lit gloom. The piano player's fingers froze over the keys, and conversations died mid-sentence. Clay and Jennings sat at their usual table, their faces darkening at the sight of the man who had humiliated them twice now. The stranger moved to the bar, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. Every eye in the saloon followed his movement, watching for any sign that tonight would bring the violence everyone had been expecting since morning. "Mighty brave coming in here," Clay called out, his voice carrying the edge of whiskey courage. "Or mighty stupid." The stranger ordered his drink without turning. Behind him, chairs scraped as Clay and Jennings stood up. "Man ought to know when he's not welcome," Jennings added, moving to flank the stranger's left side while Clay approached from the right. The piano player gathered his sheet music with trembling hands and hurried toward the door. Other patrons followed his lead, leaving only the most hardened regulars to witness what was coming. A young deputy burst through the doors, his tin star gleaming new on his chest. "Now hold on," he started. "There ain't gonna be—" Clay's backhand caught the deputy across the face, sending him sprawling. "Shut your mouth, boy. This ain't about the law." The stranger finally turned, his eyes taking in the fallen deputy. "Everything's about the law," he said quietly. "Or there's nothing but chaos." "Law?" Clay laughed harshly. "Look around you, mister. Do you see any law here? Sheriff's gone, the deputy's on his back, and you're all alone." The stranger's voice remained steady. "Been alone before. Doesn't change what's right." "Right?" Jennings spat. "Only thing that's right is what a man can back up with his gun, and you're outnumbered." "Numbers don't matter much," the stranger replied. "When a man's in the wrong—" Clay's face flushed red. "Are you trying to say we're in the wrong? After what you did this morning?" "You threatened innocent people," the stranger said. "As far as I'm concerned, you got off easy." Clay's hand dropped to his new gun. "Maybe it's time we settled this properly. No tricks, no shooting guns out of hand. Just straight death, like men." The stranger shook his head slowly. "Nothing manly about killing for pride." "Then what about killing for pay?" Jennings grinned. "Mendoza's offering good money for your head." "Better men have tried," the stranger said softly. "They're all still trying." Clay drew his gun, but once again the stranger moved like lightning. A single shot rang out, and Clay's weapon clattered to the floor, a perfect hole drilled through its cylinder. "Walk away," the stranger advised, his gun already back in its holster. "While you still can." Clay and Jennings backed toward the door, their faces pale with renewed fear. The fallen deputy picked himself up, watching in awe as the two outlaws fled into the gathering night. The night air carried a bitter chill as the stranger stepped onto the wooden walkway outside the Broken Spur. Lamplight spilled from the saloon's windows, casting long shadows across the weathered boards. He knew what was coming, had known since Clay's hasty retreat inside. "Hold it right there!" Clay's voice rang out from behind him. The young gunman had circled around the building, positioning himself in the street. His earlier fear had hardened into desperate determination. The stranger turned slowly. A crowd began gathering at the edges of the street, drawn by the prospect of violence. Among them stood Willis, his hand resting near his own gun. But the stranger gave him a slight shake of the head. This was his fight. "Thought you might try something foolish," the stranger said quietly. "Foolish?" Clay's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "What's foolish is thinking you can waltz into our town and make us look like children. Well, that ends tonight." Movement caught the stranger's eye. Briggs, Jennings, and Two-Bit Tommy had taken up positions around the street, creating a rough circle. Their hands hovered near their weapons. "Last chance to walk away," the stranger offered, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "You've humiliated me twice now," Clay snarled. "Nobody does that and lives. Nobody." The stranger's eyes narrowed slightly. "Pride's a poor reason for dying, boy." "Enough talk!" Clay's hand dropped to his gun. "Draw!" What happened next would be talked about in Mesa Falls for years to come. Clay's draw was fast, faster than most men could follow. But the stranger's movement was like summer lightning, his gun seeming to materialize in his hand. A single shot cracked through the night. Clay's gun went spinning. A perfect hole drilled through its barrel before it could clear his holster. The young gunman stood frozen, staring at his empty hand in disbelief. "Jesus!" someone whispered from the crowd. Briggs was the first to move, but the stranger's gun swung toward him with impossible speed. "Don't," the stranger warned softly. "He's right," Briggs said, raising his hand slowly. "This fight's done." But Clay wasn't finished. "Kill him!" he screamed, his face contorted with rage. "All of you, kill him now!" Neither Jennings nor Two-Bit Tommy moved. They'd seen enough to know better. "I'm not leaving," the stranger announced, his voice carrying to every ear. "And I won't stand by while you terrorize this town. Choice is yours. Walk away or face what comes." Clay backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't over! When Mendoza gets here, then I'll deal with him too." The crowd parted as Clay and his men retreated into the darkness. Willis approached the stranger, shaking his head in wonder. "Never seen anything like that?" the former deputy said quietly. "Not in all my years." The stranger holstered his gun with fluid grace. "Night's not over yet," he replied. "And something tells me the real trouble's just beginning." A cloud of dust on the horizon announced Mendoza's arrival before anyone saw his riders. The stranger watched from the hotel window as 15 mounted men rode into Mesa Falls, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth. At their head rode a man in an expensive black coat, his silver-trimmed sombrero marking him as someone who commanded respect, or at least feared it. The town grew quiet as death as the riders dismounted outside the broken spur. Mendoza moved with the casual arrogance of a man unused to opposition, his spurs singing against the wooden walkway. 2 guards flanked him, their rifles carried openly across their saddles. Inside the saloon, Briggs and Clay stood as Mendoza entered. The Mexican's dark eyes swept the room, taking in every detail before settling on Clay with obvious disappointment. "So," Mendoza's voice carried a cultured edge that made his words more threatening, not less. "You cannot handle one man? One simple stranger makes you look like a child?" Clay's face reddened. "He's no ordinary gunman, Don Mendoza. He's—" "Silence!" Mendoza cut him off with a sharp gesture. "I do not care if he is the devil himself. Mesa Falls is crucial to our operations. The route must be secured." Briggs stepped forward cautiously. "We tried to warn him off, but you failed." Mendoza's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now I must clean up your mess. Tell me about this man." From his vantage point, the stranger watched Mendoza's men positioning themselves around town. They moved with military precision, taking up strategic points that would control key streets and approaches. Willis appeared at his elbow, speaking in low tones. 15 riders out front. But I count at least 10 more circling around the back of town. They're professionals, not common bandits." "Figured as much," the stranger replied quietly. This was never about Clay's gang. They were just the advance guard. Town's scared, Willis added. Mendoza's reputation runs dark. They say he burned 3 villages in Sonora just to prove a point. The stranger's hand touched the silver watch chain at his vest. A man's reputation is just words? I've known worse. Below, Mendoza emerged from the saloon, his cold gaze sweeping the street until it found the hotel. For a moment, his eyes seemed to meet the stranger's, and a smile played across his face that promised violence to come. Last chance to ride out, Willis offered. No one would blame you. The stranger shook his head. Some things a man can't ride away from. Some fights need fighting. Then you'll need help. Already got it. The stranger nodded toward the street, where townspeople were quietly closing their shops, moving their families to safety, preparing for what they knew was coming. Sometimes, standing alone means standing with everyone. Mendoza mounted his horse, still smiling that cold smile. The war for Mesa Falls was about to begin in earnest. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls of the Broken Spur's back room as the stranger gathered with his unlikely war council. Willis sat to his right, checking the loads in his old Colt. The bartender, Joe Miller, nervously wiped glasses while McCready and 5 other townsmen huddled around the scarred wooden table. Mendoza's men are here for more than just show, Willis explained, laying out a rough map of Mesa Falls drawn on butcher paper. They've taken positions at every major intersection. Professional work. Town's boxed in, the stranger agreed, his finger tracing routes through the streets. They'll try to control who comes and goes, isolate us before they move. McCready cleared his throat. Why not just kill you and be done with it? Why all this? Because it was never about me, the stranger replied quietly. I'm just an excuse. Mendoza wants Mesa Falls, a quiet town between territories where he can move his goods without drawing attention. Then what chance do we have? Joe asked. We're just ordinary folks. The stranger's eyes carried the weight of old battles. I've seen ordinary folks do extraordinary things when pushed far enough. Question is, are you ready to fight for your town? A moment of silence followed. Then Tom Wilson, a rancher with rough hands and a weathered face, spoke up. Been running cattle here for 30 years. Ain't about to let some bandit run me off my land. Others nodded, courage kindling in their eyes. I've faced men like Mendoza before, the stranger said, his hand touching the silver watch chain. During the war and after. Led a group of marshals against the Carson gang in '68. Everyone said they were unbeatable. The Carson gang? Willis straightened. That was the Silver Brand's work. Took down 30 men without... His voice trailed off as understanding dawned. The stranger didn't confirm or deny, just continued speaking. We'll need lookouts on the church tower and the mercantile roof. Barricades ready to block the streets. Every man who can shoot, armed and positioned. The men leaned forward as he outlined his plan. Outside, the wind whispered through Mesa Falls' empty streets, while Mendoza's men kept their watch. There's something else, Willis added. The women and children. Diana's offered her root cellar, Joe interrupted. It's deep, with a tunnel that comes up behind the livery stable. Good escape route if needed. The stranger nodded approval. We move tonight, while they think we're still scared and confused. By morning, we'll be ready. And then, McCready asked. Then we show Mendoza that some towns aren't worth taking. The stranger's voice carried quiet certainty. Some fights aren't about who's strongest, but who's fighting for something worth dying for. The men around the table straightened, feeling the truth of his words in their bones. Mesa Falls was their home, and they would defend it or die trying. Fire bloomed in the night like an evil flower as Mendoza's men torched Wilson's barn. The flames painted the sky orange, casting wild shadows across Mesa Falls while horses screamed in terror. More fires sparked to life at the blacksmith shop, the coordinated attack designed to spread panic through the town. They're moving, Willis called from his position on the church tower. "2 groups, 6 men each, coming up Main Street and around by the livery." The stranger crouched behind a water trough, his silver watch catching the firelight. He'd been expecting this. The fires were just a diversion to flush out defenders and test their positions. "Remember," his voice carried to the hidden townsman, "wait for my signal." Mendoza's men moved like shadows, their boots silent on the packed earth. Clay rode with them, his face eager for revenge. As they passed the general store, the stranger's voice cut through the crackling of flames. "That's far enough." The raiders spun, weapons rising, but the stranger had already fired twice. Guns flew from hands, accompanied by cursing in Spanish and English. More shots rang out as the townsmen opened fire from concealed positions, forcing the attackers to dive for cover. "Kill him!" Clay screamed, scrambling behind a wagon. "Kill them all!" But the stranger's plan was working. Mendoza's professional gunmen found themselves caught in a crossfire, their usual tactics useless against opponents they couldn't see. The town they'd thought defenseless had become a trap. "Briggs!" the stranger called out, recognizing the old outlaw among the raiders. "Still time to choose the right side." A moment of silence followed, broken only by the roar of flames. Then Briggs stood up, holstering his gun. "Always knew this was wrong," he said, turning to face his former companions. 2 more raiders followed his lead. "Traitors!" Clay shrieked, firing wildly. The stranger's answering shot knocked the gun from his hand with surgical precision. The remaining raiders retreated, dragging their wounded. As they fled, Willis's voice rang out again. "Rider coming! Fast! From the south!" The stranger turned to see a lone horseman galloping through the firelight. The rider pulled up short, silhouetted against the burning barn. "Message from Don Mendoza," the man announced in accented English. "This is just the beginning. Tomorrow he burns the whole town unless the stranger surrenders himself." "Tell Mendoza I've got a message too," the stranger replied, his voice carrying across the night. "Mesa Falls isn't his to burn, and I don't surrender." The messenger wheeled his horse and vanished into the darkness. Behind him, townsmen worked to extinguish the fires, while Willis organized guards for the night. "He'll come with everything now," Briggs warned, approaching the stranger. "No more tests, no more warnings." The stranger watched the flames dying against the star-filled sky. "Good," he said quietly. "Time we ended this." The sun climbed toward its zenith over Mesa Falls, the heat already shimmering off the packed earth of Main Street. Mendoza sat astride his black stallion at one end of the street, his silver-trimmed jacket gleaming. Behind him, 12 mounted gunmen waited with rifles drawn, while more took positions on nearby rooftops. The stranger stood alone at the other end, his duster moving slightly in the hot wind. Willis and the townsmen had taken hidden positions as planned, ready for what might come. "Last chance to surrender, amigo," Mendoza called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the distance. "Save these good people from unnecessary bloodshed." "Funny," the stranger replied. "I was about to offer you the same choice." Mendoza's laugh was sharp and cold. "You still don't understand. This moment, this confrontation, it's nothing but theater. While we stand here trading words, my men are already moving on the bank." The stranger didn't react. "Willis," he said quietly. "Already on it," came the reply through an open window. "Tom and the others are in position. They won't get near that bank." Mendoza's eyes narrowed as he studied the stranger. The famous silver brand. "Yes, I know who you are. Tell me, how many men have you killed? How many lives ended by your legendary speed?" "Not as many as you'd think," the stranger answered. "Man's got a choice about killing. Same choice you've got right now." The heat grew more intense as noon approached. Sweat trickled down faces on both sides, but neither man moved. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the bank, then another and another. But the sounds weren't what Mendoza expected. His head snapped around as 3 of his men stumbled out onto the street, their guns gone, hands raised. "Your bank raid just failed," the stranger said calmly. "Want to try something else?" Mendoza's composed facade cracked. "Kill him!" he screamed to his men. "Kill them all!" But before anyone could fire, a new sound cut through the tension. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, approaching fast. Around both corners of Main Street rode a company of U.S. Marshals, led by a familiar face that made the stranger's eyes widen slightly. "Federal Marshals!" a voice boomed out. "Drop your weapons!" Mendoza's men froze, caught between their boss's orders and 24 leveled rifles. The stranger alone seemed unsurprised, though his next words carried a hint of genuine emotion. "You're late, Sarah," he called to the lead marshal, a woman with steel-gray hair and a familiar silver watch chain hanging from her vest. "Traffic was hell, Pa," she answered with a grim smile. "Thought you might need some help cleaning up your old town." Sarah Brand dismounted with the same fluid grace as her father, her marshal's badge catching the noon sun. Mendoza's men saw uncertainty between their boss and the ring of federal rifles now surrounding them. The tension in the street could have been cut with a knife. "Drop your weapons," Sarah ordered, her voice carrying the same quiet authority as her father's. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Briggs was the first to move, tossing his gun into the dust. Others followed, but Mendoza remained mounted, his face twisted with rage. Clay, at his side, looked ready to bolt. "This changes nothing," Mendoza snarled. "You have no jurisdiction here, no warrants, no authority." "3 dead marshals in Arizona say different things," Sarah replied coldly. "Plus weapons trafficking, murder, and enough witnesses to hang you 10 times over." The stranger stepped forward, positioning himself between his daughter and Mendoza. "It's over, Don Rafael. You're done in Mesa Falls." Mendoza's hand dropped to his gun. "Perhaps, but I can still take you with me, Silverbrand." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Mendoza drew, fast as a striking snake. Clay, seizing his chance, also went for his weapon. But father and daughter moved as one, their guns appearing as if by magic. 2 shots rang out as one. Mendoza's gun went spinning, a perfect hole drilled through its barrel. Clay's weapon suffered the same fate, both men disarmed with surgical precision. "Like father, like daughter," Willis murmured from nearby. Mendoza stared at his empty hand in disbelief. "Impossible. No one is that fast." "Runs in the family," Sarah said, keeping her gun trained on him as marshals moved in to make arrests. The stranger turned to his daughter. "Been tracking him for a long time?" 6 months, ever since he killed those marshals." She holstered her gun. "When I heard he was heading to Mesa Falls, I knew. This was always going to end where it started." "Where do you start?" "Where you hung up your guns, Pa. Where Ma died." The townspeople watched in fascination as the pieces fell together. The stranger, the legendary Silverbrand, had once called Mesa Falls home. Now his past and present had collided in its dusty streets. "Town's changed," he said quietly. "So have we." Sarah's eyes softened slightly. "But some things stay the same, like a brand always protecting what's right." As Mendoza and his men were led away in chains, father and daughter stood together in the street where both their legends had now been written. Mesa Falls had seen its share of violence, but today it had witnessed something rarer: justice served by a family's hand. Willis approached them, smiling. "Reckon Mesa Falls could use a new sheriff, and maybe a deputy, too." Mendoza thrashed against his chains as the marshals led him toward their waiting wagon. His once immaculate coat was covered in dust, his dignity stripped away with his defeat. Clay stood nearby, similarly bound, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. "This isn't over, Brand!" Mendoza shouted. "You think chains can hold me? I have friends in high places!" "Had friends," Sarah corrected, checking the locks on his restraints. Amazing how quick they disappear when the federal marshals start asking questions. The stranger, now known to all as the legendary Silverbrand, watched the scene unfold. Willis approached, gesturing toward Briggs and the other outlaws who had surrendered. "What about them?" the former deputy asked. Brand studied the men thoughtfully. "Sometimes a man deserves a second chance, if he's willing to earn it." Briggs stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "I knew what we were doing was wrong. Should have stood up sooner." "Not too late to start standing up now," Brand replied. "Town's going to need good men to help rebuild." Sarah rejoined them, her marshal's badge glinting. "Some of these men have outstanding warrants. Can't just let that go." "No," her father agreed. "But a man working to make things right counts for something in front of a judge, especially with a marshal's recommendation." Understanding passed between father and daughter. Sarah nodded slowly. "Reckon Mesa Falls could use some men who know the difference between right and wrong, even if they learned it the hard way." Clay suddenly broke free from his guards, desperation lending him strength. He made it 3 steps before father and daughter drew as one, but neither fired. Instead, Briggs stepped into Clay's path, catching the young outlaw with a solid right hand. "That's enough, boy," Briggs said as Clay sprawled in the dust. "Time to face what's coming." The gathered townspeople began to disperse, heading off to assess damage and begin repairs. The night's fires had left scars, but Mesa Falls still stood. "Got a proposition for you, Pa," Sarah said as they watched the marshals load their prisoners. "Town needs a sheriff, someone who knows its heart." Brand touched the silver watch chain at his vest. "Thought I was done with badges." "Maybe badges aren't done with you," she smiled. "Besides, I could use a break from the trail. Deputy's job might suit me fine for a spell." Willis grinned. "Like old times, eh, Brand? Except now, you've got backup." "Had backup before," Brand replied, watching Briggs organize other reformed outlaws to help with repairs. "Just didn't know where to find it." The sun began its westward slide, casting long shadows across Mesa Falls. The town had changed, and with it, the man who had once called it home. Sometimes, Brand reflected, the hardest thing wasn't running from your past. It was finding the courage to embrace it again. The first shot came without warning. One of Mendoza's hidden men opened fire from a ridge, the bullet striking the marshal's wagon. In the chaos that followed, Mendoza kicked free of his captors and sprinted for a waiting horse. Clay close behind him. "Head them off!" Sarah shouted, already running for her mount. "They'll make for Canyon Pass!" Brand was moving before she finished speaking, swinging onto his horse with practiced ease. Behind them, Willis organized men to protect the town, while the remaining marshals secured their other prisoners. The desert sun beat down mercilessly as they pursued the escapees. Mendoza and Clay had a head start, but Brand knew these canyons like he knew his own heart. He'd learned to ride here, learned to shoot here, learned to track men who didn't want to be found. "There," Sarah pointed to dust rising beyond a rock formation. "They're trying to circle back." "No," Brand called out, reading the signs differently. "They're heading for the old mine, only place to hide for miles." They guided their horses through narrow gaps between towering red rocks, the ground falling away sharply on either side. A rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, forcing them to duck low over their saddles. "Clay's covering their retreat," Sarah observed, drawing her gun. "Good position up there." "Too good," Brand agreed. "This is a trap." As if confirming his words, more gunfire erupted from above. Mendoza had led them into a natural killing ground, with shooters positioned on both sides of the canyon. "Like fish in a barrel," Sarah muttered, taking shelter behind a boulder. But Brand was already moving, his horse scrambling up a nearly invisible trail he remembered from decades past. Sarah watched in amazement as her father seemed to ride straight up the canyon wall. "Just like your mother," he called down to her. "She never could sit still in a fight, either." From his new position, Brand had a clear view of Mendoza's men. 2 quick shots sent their rifles spinning away, leaving them exposed. Sarah's answering fire kept them pinned down, while her father continued climbing. Clay broke first, running for his horse. But Mendoza stood his ground, turning to face Brand with murder in his eyes. "End of the line, Don Rafael," Brand called out. "Though you can try for your gun if you want." Mendoza's hand twitched. "They say you never kill if you can help it, Silverbrand. That your famous mercy is your weakness." "Not mercy," Brand corrected, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Choice. Same choice I'm giving you now." For a moment, the canyon held its breath. Then Mendoza went for his hidden derringer, only to find his sleeve empty. "Looking for this?" Sarah asked from behind him, holding the small gun. A Brand always watches the other hand. Mendoza's shoulders slumped in defeat. His empire of violence ended not with a bang, but with a father and daughter's shared wisdom. A month after Mendoza's capture, Mesa Falls was beginning to look like itself again. The burned buildings had been rebuilt, their fresh wood standing bright against the weathered structures around them. A new sign hung outside the jail, Sheriff John Brand, with Deputy Sarah Brand written neatly below it. The morning sun found Brand at his wife's grave, carefully tending the small plot behind the church. He'd added fresh flowers and finally replaced the worn wooden marker with proper stone. "Thought I'd find you here," Sarah said, approaching quietly. "Town council's waiting to start the meeting." Brand nodded, touching the silver watch chain that had given him his legend. "Your mother would have liked seeing you wear that badge." "And seeing you wear one again, too," Sarah smiled. "Though some folks still can't believe the Silver Brand settled down to be a small-town sheriff." "Sometimes the biggest adventures are the quiet ones," he replied, standing. They walked together through the awakening town. Briggs and his reformed men were already at work, helping McCready unload supplies at the mercantile. Clay's trial was scheduled for next week. The judge had been lenient given his youth and eventual cooperation. The Broken Spur's doors were open, morning light spilling across its clean-swept floors. Joe had hired Tom Wilson's boy to play piano in the evenings, and the music had brought a new spirit to the old saloon. "Got word from the marshal's office," Sarah said as they walked. "Mendoza's gang is finished. His friends in high places are scrambling to avoid prosecution themselves." "Town's changing," Brand observed. "Growing." "Good changes," Willis called out from his new hardware store. "Stage companies even talking about making Mesa Falls a regular stop." They reached the town hall where the council had gathered to discuss Mesa Falls' future. Brand paused at the steps, looking back down the street where he'd faced down Mendoza just weeks ago. "Having second thoughts about staying?" Sarah asked quietly. Brand shook his head. "Just remembering something your mother used to say, about how a town's only as good as the people willing to fight for it." She was right about that. Like she was right about you coming back here someday. Inside, the council was debating new buildings, schools, and opportunities. Mesa Falls was no longer just a quiet town between territories. It had found its own identity, its own strength. Brand took his place at the table, his badge catching the morning light. He'd spent years building his legend, but now he was building something else. A future, a home, a legacy beyond fast guns and notched belts. "All right," he said to the gathered townspeople, his quiet voice carrying the same authority it always had. "Let's see what tomorrow brings." And Mesa Falls, the town that had birthed the legend of the Silver Brand, settled in to write its next chapter.